Hey guys, the PTR patch got delayed, but the devs have released some early patch notes that we can extrapolate some stuff on. I originally made this video and covered everything. That turned out to be like a 45-minute video, so I'm going to be breaking it down into parts this time. I'm going to start off with the major PvP changes. The big change that will affect every class is Hale and Hardy got removed from a town thing, but that's got added as a passive buff. And then Stalwart seems to have just been removed altogether. There was a recent change that made it so that the stamina regen cap was plus 30% and Stalwart was plus 20%, which put a lot of perks in a weird spot where you would go over the regen cap for stamina. So I think removing this kind of makes sense and gives a little bit more depth to that uh, stam regen kind of pool, if you will. So I think this makes sense as a whole, but people will not be genning stam as fast now. I expect people to stam out a little bit more, and for people to have to kind of compensate for that. It's not a huge nerf, but you definitely feel it right now if you don't have Stalwart. Going into PvP combat changes, there were some updates to like blocking stuff that was kind of relatively minor where that wasn't being affected. This is the change for Hale and Hardy that they compensated from. There's a few changes that make it a little bit easier to actually switch weapons in PvP, which is kind of nice. So that's going to be something that opens up a little bit more possibilities to get creative at times. And then uh they made blocking less punishing and buffed blocking altogether. These blocking buffs will basically effectively make it so that range classes that once really thrived, I don't think will be super viable as like a range class anymore. One thing that you can do, like from a healer perspective, is like before, if you were getting beamed by a musket, even with the old musket changes, there was not too much that you could do. You could try to dodge the actual individual shots. Versus now, what you could do is you could put a sacred down at your feet, and then you could just block, and then you should be able to regen your health faster than the musket can do damage, meaning that the musket has to waste their time shooting you, and nothing really happens, and there's not a big punish for it. So I think this is just going to make it so that ranged players can't really victimize a lot of people anymore. And then there's also a really big playstyle shift with this, where with the ability to block, you're able to hold space better, and the other team's kind of backline or earn their space when you're trying to take space. So if like you're pushing into the healers, for example, or like bows or decks, and they look at you, before you'd have to get all the way out and get find the nearest piece of cover, right? Which would usually be like bonfire or something kind of map geometry oriented. Now you will just be able to block potentially and just ask for heals, and you'll be able to outlive the burst by just blocking. This is kind of a niche thing where it could be better in a 1v1 situation, but if you're being targeted by like five people at the same time, blocking might be worse than dodging. Kind of hard to tell at the moment, but this enables people to kind of have this different playstyle where they don't necessarily have to give up the space they take, but instead can hold the space that they have taken by blocking itself and then calling for additional resources, which will basically make it so that you can push in the other team's backlines a lot harder, and ranged in general is getting a pretty big nerf from these changes, I think, on paper. In terms of the blocking functionality, the way this works now is depending on what weapon that you have, you will be able to block a percentage of the damage that's incoming. With an SNS, that's 100%, but with these other weapons, it's kind of a percentile. So with magic, 40% of the range attack damage will penetrate the block, right? So that's not as much. You're blocking 60% of the damage. Two-handed weapons, you're blocking 70%. One-handed, you're blocking 50%. So you get the idea here. Blocking seems relatively good. I think the one thing that kind of this opens up a lot too is Ice Gauntlet, weirdly, because Ice Gauntlet has a perk on it where if you block, you will use some of your mana and translate that into flat block. So you'll actually be able to live like fairly well, I think, if you time blocking with the actual Ice Gauntlet itself now, which is really nice from like a range perspective. Like if a BB's hitting you, each one of those pellets is going to proc that, right? So you're gonna go crazy in terms of like how you're genning your block. Shields don't remain changed though, they just increase the base movement speed, which will allow people to be a little bit more dynamic, but it's not a major change. There were some kind of bug fixes with NetShot where you can kind of get it to apply in cases where it shouldn't have been able to apply. There were some other ones with extended chamber that made it really annoying, and a lot of people just did not take extended chamber because it felt like a debuff more than a buff itself at a certain point, and people started going for left tree because extended chamber didn't feel that good at all. Fix an issue or rune gloss dot gems under on hit bonuses were triggered from the impact of plague splitting grenade. This is like a kind of a minor nerf, but it's something that they kind of looked at across the board. They're adjusting rune gloss dot gems, which is good. because there are a lot of bugs that were involved with that that allowed you to do things like with SNS, you're able to gen a lot of stam for like basically no reason. Blast shot, they increased the range. I think this is like a really sleeper buff that could make it actually pretty good. It feels kind of difficult to land right now. If people are trying to get on you, you could use the blast shot for the grit, and then you can use that in combination with them being in an animation after they hit you that they can't block it, and you could force them to use stam or they get knocked over. So it was like nichely good, but I think this enables it to be like viable. I wouldn't say it's like a great ability, but it's not a terrible thing to take for sure. Bow, you have to keep these bow changes in combination in mind with the block changes, but they fixed some passives on the bow. They increased the damage of random arrows, so they're basically turning bow into like kind of a. It's going to have the ability to play as sort of a pseudo fire staff with that AOE damage. Dodge and weave, no updated functionality to only trigger when at full stand, so it's a pretty big nerf. Knee shot got changed, and I had to hit like what do you call it? You have to hit a headshot now for it to trigger. So now it's a rending shot, not knee shot, because you're not hitting people in the knee. So that's uh, enabling you like they're trying to make it so that you want to go for headshots with the ranged weapons, which kind of makes sense, but I don't think it's super consistent. So it's a pretty big nerf to bow overall. Fire stuff, the invigorated punishment change has been identified as to devs as a bug, so that may get fixed as well. So fire staff will get a damage bonus from that when that gets fixed. Incinerate got a really big buff where they increased the damage and they reduced the recovery so that you'll be able to get out of it a little bit faster. Pillar Fire got a damage nerf, and then they've done some bug fixes like with Meteor Shower where that was being buggy. And then Flare kind of got buffed a little bit as well. Great Axe Execute got adjusted. I believe this is a buff, but I'm not exactly sure. It's kind of hard to tell until we play with it, and they reduce the cooldowns. Execute, I don't think is ever going to be super viable because there's not really a slot to run it in unless you're running a sort of hybrid build. Like if you run SNS Great Axe, you kind of have a spot to take like either like an Execute or a Reap or something like that. So you have like an option there, but I don't see it really being a big change altogether. But I wouldn't say Execute is like terrible. I ran it into far more and it hits for like 4 to 5k when I'm normally hitting for like 1 to 2k. So it's not a actually terrible ability at times. Whirlwind got a pretty big buff. They're making it so that it hits more and that you move more, and you can get out of it, so you're no longer trapped in that giant animation. So that seems like all like really really big buffs to Whirlwind as a whole. So heavy bruiser on up and up potentially. Reap got a damage nerf, which kind of makes sense, given how abusive Reap is to like some people. Great sword, they buffed the actual fortify and they increased the duration from Roaring Rupture. This is just a flat out good change, which felt kind of needed. Skyward Slash got a nerf in terms of the hitbox, so that's something to keep in mind. Hatchet got some buffs, but it's mostly on the throwing hatchet side, so I think this affects PvE more than PvP, because I don't see throwing hatchet ever really being meta from a PvP perspective. The only thing that's like decent from a PvP perspective is an infected throw because it's an AoE lingering disease, kind of like bile, but it seems relatively niche to go for it. There's also kind of an interesting interaction with Hatchet now with Ascent where you could pop Berserk, so you get the lifesteal, and then you can use the Dark Ascent, go up in the air, come back down, and then the leeching will stack on top of that leeching, and then you can basically get a full heal. But that's the only two circumstances where I see Hatchet being uh, usable. But Dark Ascent did get that buff on the live client where you have some more iframes with that, so it's like kind of interesting, but not super interesting in my opinion. Ice Gauntlet, the Ice Pylon will be destroyed if Ice Gauntlet is unequipped. I think this is just kind of a bug fix. It will still persist if Ice Gauntlet is equipped, but inactive. Uh, I don't know if this means off the wording that if you have your Ice Gauntlet on your secondary bar and you have your primary weapon out that it won't shoot. If it got changed to that, it effectively makes it so Pylon's not the ult battery it once was, and it makes it so that people probably will not really consider Pylon as much. At that point, you're considering Pylon if you're trying to be on Ice Gauntlet all the time and be like an ice damage dealer, which isn't really a thing at the moment, but people have tried to make it work ever since the kind of blocking change with Ice Tomb happened, where it's just a lot less effective. I don't really see if this comes through. I don't really see Pylon being played a ton anymore. Wind chill got grit on it, which is nice, but you still can't cancel wind chill, as far as I'm aware, and it's just inconsistent. So I wouldn't say wind chill. It's gonna be in the meta, but it's nice that it got grit. Life staff, they've gutted Splash of Life range, which basically makes it so that's probably not going to get played anymore, even with the increased healing. The only way I see this really being played is on the Gate Breach. Musket got a powder shot and powder burn change, where that's just more consistent, and you don't have to like reload before you go for it every single time. But in combination with the blocking changes, I don't really see Musket being viable, even with this kind of buff, because the blocking changes just make it such a big nerf, since you won't be able to out damage what people are blocking most likely. Sword and Shield, there's some bug fixes for Leaping Strike. There's a new sword, or a sword that they're updating to be legendary, which isn't a super big deal. And then they've corrected some of the shields so that they have the appropriate block categories. There were some tower shields that were giving the kite shield block before, and some kite shields that were giving the round shield block stam wise. So that's a pretty big fix that that needed to happen. Whirlwinding Blade got a pretty big buff. This could be viable from a DPS SNS perspective, especially with the rend increase, but I don't really see it being insane. If it has a stagger built into it, which I'm not sure if it does, because the only time I've really used Whirlwind Blades like at level 1 when you start off in a fresh character, just to have an ability, but uh, then it could be good as a chase mechanism, but SNS already has so many good chase mechanisms, I'm not sure if it's really necessary. Reverse stab seems like it has the potential to be viable now if they've adjusted the honing and it's not as static anymore. So this is really, really cool sounding and something that I'm definitely going to try. Defiant Stance got like a stam damage uh, decrease while it's active, which is good, but from a PvP perspective, this normally gets stripped immediately when you go into Defiant Stance because it's a super long animation, and there's like 2 to 3 IGVs on point, literally waiting for you to use that so that they could drop the Oblivion. So I don't see it being a really big difference in PvP, but it could be a big difference in PvE. And they've made it so that the buff is applied earlier, which is good because sometimes you cast it, you just die. Defensive formation, they've increased the AoE from 3 to 4 meters, which is a really, really big change. If you think about the radius of a circle, it is like pi r squared. So that R component went from 3 to 4, so you have that 9 meters of area that went all the way up to 16 meters, which is a 7-meter increase, which is a really, really big deal, even though it's a one number change. I think this is more impactful in PvE than PvP because a lot of people don't run defensive formation in PvE. They would rather go for leadership. But from a PvP perspective, this is super, super big and is a really big SNS buff on top of a weapon that probably deserves to be nerfed in some regard. Shield Rush, they've reduced the recovery of the extra animation that is played with the upgrades by 7 frames. This is just helpful because sometimes that's a kind of long and wonky animation. Spear Cyclone got a damage increase, they sped up the attacks, they adjusted the hitbox, which is good. Void Gauntlet, this is the one that's really, really interesting. So Tether now will be active while swapping to your secondary. What this potentially means if I go to the New World Skill Builder, where you can kind of show off like all the skills that you'd have on something. If you look at the second perk on Tether, successful hits against tethered targets reduce other Void Gauntlet cooldowns by 5%. This has the potential to not have a limit on it necessarily. So like a lot of the refreshing stuff, they have an inherent cooldown built into it. So you might be able to do this with BB and get 30 to 40% CDR on Void Gauntlet abilities per shot that you take on the person that is tethered, which would instantly make tethered like an S tier ability. If that is the case, if it's not the case, I don't know how impactful it will be, but given some of the ice pylon changes, I think there's an argument for maybe AoE healers being like, hey, I want to go for AoE healer. I want to go for this right tree. I want to run tether for people to get close to me. I want to slow them down, apply a weaken to them, and then kind of play off of that. The other thing that tether allows you to do is it gives you empower. It slows the target, so it's a really good chase thing. This instantly makes tether like very, very viable from a PvP perspective, and is super, super interesting and definitely will be played around with a lot. Essence Rupture got a tooltip update. This is not really impactful to the weapon as a whole. Warhammer, Mighty Gavel got buffed a bit. I don't think it will be viable, but it is interesting that it's got buffed. The big one is Armor Breaker. They got a damage increase. The Ren got increased, and they made it so this opening act doesn't have to be against the target at 100% health, but instead has to be above 70%. So really, really big Armor Breaker buffs could potentially be viable again. It kind of fell off once the Rend and Fortify changes went out, but we will see if it becomes viable once again when this gets released on, I believe, July 6th is the patch day. Rapier Flurry got buffed to a degree. Some of the PvEers think it's more of a nerf because the trick was you'd go for the last hit thing because it scaled and then you would just do tons of damage. But it's more consistent from a PvP perspective, so I think it's a slight buff from a PvP perspective, and they made each individual attack hone, which is like the changes for the hatchet with Raging Torrent, which is kind of interesting. Social distancing, I forgot to mention this before, but they've also made it so that the root no longer has a conditional, so that's going to be super super good. Because then it could be within 6 meters, you can get the refreshing distance throw perk, which will reduce the cooldown by like 50% almost, and then you can root someone with that as well. So that just makes Hatchet really good for living again. But it's a kind of a different style of living than before. And I don't want to go over the Outpost Rush changes in this video, but those ones are super interesting as well. Let me know what you guys think of these perk changes as a whole. The other big things too is Void Gauntlet got I think it got a buff to the amount of grit it has on Void Blade, and you can roll thwarting strikes on it now, so that will make Void Blade deal more damage as a whole. So there's a potential for Void Gauntlets to play as an actual pseudo bruiser again, which we thought would be viable, but never really turned out to be super popular with the current patch because the grit windows were just not big enough to really consider it. But yeah, guys, I'll see you in the next video. These changes look super, super promising, and there is a lot coming, so stay tuned. Peace.